Hi there, welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to discuss about the solution for finding longest consecutive sequence in the given input array. Let's look at the problem description. We are given an unsorted array of integer nums and we have to return the length of the longest consecutive sequence of elements in that array. Okay. And we must write an algorithm that runs in order of n time. Let's take a look at the example 1. So the nums array has 6 elements. So in this, the consecutive elements are 1, 2, 3, 4. That is the longest consecutive element. So the output is 4. And in the case of example 2, the nums array has 10 elements. It starts from 0 to 8 and there are 2 zeros. Excluding the duplicates, the longest sequence is 0 to 8, 9. In the example 3, the nums array has 4 elements. In that, there is a duplicate for the number 1 and the unique numbers which forms the longest sequence is 0, 1, 2. So that's why the output is 3. The constraints for this problem are the length of the array is ranging from 0 to 10 to the power 5 and the individual elements value is ranging from minus 10 to the power 9 to 10 to the power 9. Let's look at the approach to solve this problem. So the given input array is not sorted, so we cannot easily check whether the adjacent numbers are consecutive numbers. Okay, so we need some other data structure to check whether the current number has its neighbor already present in the input data. Okay, so for that we can use the map data structure. So in this map we store the length of the sequence for the numbers present at the boundary of the current sequence. So whenever a new element is added and the length of the sequence increase, then for that sequence the first element in that sequence and the last element in the sequence will be added to the map with the length of that new sequence. Okay. In addition to that, there will be one entry added for the current number being processed with the current length of the sequence. Okay. For example, in this case, when we start processing, the first element is 1. We compute the previous consecutive number and the next consecutive number based on the current number's value. So for this, the previous number is 0, the next number is 2. And we check whether there is an entry for those two numbers in the map. If there is an entry, then we add those numbers plus 1 for the current number being included in the sequence. If there are no entry for those numbers in the map, then we will have 0 value. So the current sequence length will be 1 the very first time. Okay. So for this case, the previous number is 0 and the next number is 2. But there is no entry for 0 as well as 2. Okay. So we will add an entry only for this number 1 with the value 1 as the length of the current sequence. So first we process the number 1. Okay. We compute the previous consecutive number and the next consecutive number for 1. So which is 0 and 2. We check whether there is an entry in this map. There is no entry, so we have 0 value. And then we include number 1 in the new sequence. So in this sequence, there is only one number which is 1. So that's why we add an entry 1 with the length 1. Next, when we process the number 0, we compute the previous consecutive number and the next consecutive number. The previous is -1 and the next is 1. Okay. So we check whether there is an entry for -1 in this map. There is no entry. But next we check whether there is an entry for number 1 in this map. There is 1. Okay. This time we add 0 plus this value 1 and 1 for this element because this is going to be added to the sequence, right? So now the current length will be 2. Okay. So after processing this element, we add an entry for this element with the new sequence length. So that's why we see 0 and 2. Next, we have to update an entry of the element present in the boundary of the new sequence. In this case, 0 and 1 forms the new sequence. So we already added a value entry for 0. Now we have to add an entry for 1. So we update this entry with a new sequence length. So like this, each time we process an element in the array, we have to find the previous and the next number and check whether there is an entry in the sequence map. If there is an entry, get the value from that entry and add plus 1 for the element being included and compute the new sequence length. Then create an entry for the current element being processed with the new sequence length and then update the boundary elements in the new sequence. In addition to that, we maintain one variable which keeps track of what is the longest sequence we have seen so far. So whenever we compute a new sequence, we compare that with the current longest sequence value. If the current sequence length is greater than the longest sequence seen so far, then we have to update that variable. At the end, we will have a longest sequence length in the longer variable. So that's what I have written here. So initialize the sequence map with an empty map of int to int and initialize the longest variable to 0. Then traverse the input array. And in each iteration, we compute the previous and the next numbers and then we read the value of for those numbers from the sequence map. And then add those values plus 1 to compute the new sequence length. And then we check whether the current length is greater than the longest. If that is true, then we update the longest variable. Then we add an entry for the current number with the new sequence length. And also we have to update the boundary elements of the new sequence. We check whether the left is greater than 0, then add an entry. And then similarly for the right, if the right is greater than 0, then we add an entry in the sequence map with the current number plus right and then with that current length. At the end of the traversal, finally we get the length of the longest sequence in this longest variable. Let's look at the flowchart. Input for this procedure is the nums array, and then first we initialize the variable longest and then the sequence map. The longest will be initialized to 0 and the sequence map is empty map. First we check whether we processed all the elements in the array. If it is not, then we read the current number and then we check whether there is an entry for the current number in the sequence map. If there is an entry, that means we already processed that element, so we have to skip the duplicate. So we go ahead and process the next element. If there is no entry, then we compute the previous number and the next number. By subtracting 1, we get the previous number. By adding 1, we get the next number. Then we look up in the sequence map, look up previous number in the sequence map and get the value and assign that to left variable. And look up the next number in the sequence map and assign the value in the right variable. Then compute the new sequence length by adding left and right plus 1 for the current element being added. Okay. Then we check whether the current sequence length is greater than the longest variable. If that is true, then we update the longest variable with the current length. Okay. Next we have to add an entry for the current num in the sequence map with the newly computed sequence length. Okay. And then we check if the left is greater than 0. If that is true, then we have to add an entry for the current number minus the left count. Previous boundary element will be computed by subtracting left from the current number. Okay. So we have to add an entry for that boundary number. So that's why we are doing current num minus left. and then assign the current length for that entry. Similarly, for if the write is greater than 0, then we add an entry for current number plus write, because this is the number present at the write boundary in the new sequence. Okay, so after we updating it, then we go ahead and process the next number. So once all the numbers are processed in the input array, then we come out and return the longest. Let's move on to coding. First I initialize the sequence map with empty map of int to int. Next I initialize the longest variable with value 0. Next I write the for loop to process the elements in the input array. First I check whether there is an entry for the current number in the sequence map. If that is true, then I skip processing that duplicate number. Next I compute the previous number by subtracting 1 from the current number, and then the next number by adding 1 to current number. Next I look up the previous number and the next number in the sequence map and assign the value in the left and right variable respectively. If there is no entry, these variables will have value 0. Next I compute the current length by adding left and then right plus 1 for the current element being processed. Then I check whether the current length is greater than longest. If that is true, then I update the longest with the value current length. Next I add an entry for the current number in the sequence map with the current length as its value. Next I update the value of the left boundary number. So the left boundary number is computed by subtracting left from the current number. I assign the current sequence length as its new value. Then I check the right is greater than 0. Then I update the right boundary number's value. The right boundary number is computed by adding right to the current number. And finally, I return the longest variable. Next, I am going to run the test cases. There is a compilation error. Let me rerun the test case. All the tests passed. Next, I am going to submit this program. Cool, this program is accepted. Next, I am going to do the code walkthrough with sample input. We are given this input array, which has 4 elements. Expected output is, first we initialize the sequence map with an empty map of int to int, and then we initialize the longest to 0. Next, we start processing the elements in this for loop. Okay, so in the iteration 0, the kernel is 1, the first element in the input array, and we check whether there is an entry for that number in the map. There is no entry, so we go ahead and compute the previous number and the next number. So previous number for 1 is 0 and the next number for 1 is 2. Okay, then we check whether there is an entry for the previous number and the next number. If so, we read and assign left and right variable respectively. So in this case, 0 and 2, there is no entry in the sequence map, so we get value 0. Okay, next we compute the current sequence length by adding left and right plus 1 for the current element being processed. In this case it is 1. So the current length become 1 because left and right are 0 plus 1, so we get the current length 1. Then we check whether the current length is greater than the longest. In this case it is true, So we update the longest. It is changed from 0 to 1. Okay. And then we add an entry for the current number with the current sequence length. So the current number is 1 and the current sequence length is 1. So we add this entry. And then in the iteration 1, we process the number 0. Okay. So the previous number for the number is -1 and the next number is 1. We read the value for those two, for the previous and the next number. So for the -1, there is no entry. So we have 0 for the variable left. And for the right, the value is the right next number is 1. So we have an entry in the sequence map. So we get 1 for the right variable. Okay. So next we compute the current length by adding left plus right plus 1. So in this case 0 plus 1 plus 1. So the current length is changed from 1 to 2. Okay. Then we add an entry for the current number in the map with the current sequence length. So the current number is 0. So for 0, we add an entry with the value 2. That is the new sequence number. Okay. Next we check whether the left is greater than 0. In this case, the left is 0. So we are not adding this entry. But for the right, it is greater than 0. So we add an entry for the number, current number plus the right variable value. The current number is 0. Right variable has value 1. So 0 plus 1, 1. So we have to update an entry which has key value 1. So this value is changed from 1 to 2. Okay. So basically the boundary element gives the total length of the current sequence. So next we process 1. So we check whether there is an entry in the sequence map for the number, current number. So in this case 1, there is an entry already. So we skip this number. Okay. And next we have number 2. Okay. And there is no entry for that number in the map. So we go ahead and compute the previous number and the next number. So the previous number for 2 is 1 and the next number for 2 is 3. We check whether there is an entry for number 1 and number 3 in the sequence map. We have only one entry for the previous number, but there is no entry for number 3. Okay. So the left variable is assigned with 2 and the right we get 0. Next we compute the current length. So the current length becomes 2 plus 0 plus 1. 2 plus 0 plus 1 for the current number 2. So the current length is changed from 2 to 3. Okay. Next we check whether the current length is greater than longest. So 3 is greater than 2. So we update the longest variable with the current length, which is 3. Okay. Next we add an entry for the current number with the current sequence length. So current number is 2. So we add an entry with the current sequence length. Okay. Next we check whether the left is greater than 0. In this case it is true. So we add an entry for the left boundary, which can be computed by subtracting left from the current number. So the current number is 2 minus the left variable is 2. So 2 minus 2, we get 0. So 0 is the leftmost element in the current sequence. Okay. So we update that entry's length with the new sequence length. So this entry's value changed from 2 to 3. Okay. And then at the end we return the value in the longest variable, which is 3. That is an expected output. Next I'm going to do the time and space complexity analysis for this solution. Time complexity for this solution is order of n. So for this input array there are 4 elements. Okay. So in order to compute the longest sequence, we have to traverse all the 4 elements in this for loop. Okay, so for this input, this for loop performs 4 iterations. If there are n elements, this for loop performs n iterations. So the time complexity for this solution is order of n. Space complexity also order of n, because we need to allocate the space for storing the sequence length. If all the elements are not consecutive, in that case we ended up having n number of entries in that map. So for the worst case, we will have n elements in the map. So the space complexity is order of n. Thanks for watching this video. Have a great day.